G'day everybody. I'm making a video today as an introductory topic to philosophy as it relates to human trade and to the epic group that we are forming. I've chosen a topic just to get things started, which is close to my heart. It's about the question of whether people are inherently good or inherently bad. Or are people predisposed to good or evil? It's a question that actually comes up on a regular basis with people that I talk to, because we need to understand why this question is actually important. I mean, our view of the world, our view of other people determines our level of trust. And it's that level of trust which can determine the nature of our relationships, because trust is the foundation of relationships. And those relationships include relationships of production and exchange. And that's why this question of whether our fellow man is good or inherently good or evil determines the nature of those exchange relationships. So there's a couple of points that I want to make. The first one is about the nature of our existence as human beings. It can be observed that we are actually physical beings who exist in a physical world. But in addition to this, we are also thinking beings that exist by way of reason. If you think about this, we are physical beings that interact with a physical world. In order to survive in this physical world, we have to interact with it. We produce things and we exchange things, physical goods and physical services, which we produce. First of all, we produce them for ourselves. As human beings and as man as a concept, we produce self-generated, self-sustaining actions by way of reason, by way of our minds. Those actions include the production of physical goods and the exchange of physical goods in order to meet our own needs, primarily at its most fundamental level. At its most fundamental level, we are existing and surviving in a physical world. Our goal is to do not only to survive, but also to thrive. But in order to do that, we have to interact with a physical world. A second point about this is that about our existence is that we also coexist with other human beings who also interact with the physical world in order to meet their own needs. In order to gain resources or to conduct our self-sustaining, self-generating action, we must interact with our fellow man, unless we want to live a very basic existence. And the way that we do that is by way of exchange, production and exchange. Again, this is a basic philosophical level where I say that one of the most fundamental human rights and powers is actually the ability to produce and exchange with our fellow man. Another point about this, or a third point about this, is that when you look at things, the nature of our production and exchange, or particularly our exchanges with our fellow man, is that we can fundamentally exchange with our fellow man two ways. In two ways. The first way is if we engage with our fellow man voluntarily. We use our minds, we use our powers of persuasion, and we make offers and acceptance with our fellow man, which can be voluntarily taken up in order to exchange with him or her. The second way that we can do these exchanges is we can interact involuntarily. The way that we can do that is we can use deception, we can use force, including physical force, or we can use threat of force in order to basically make our fellow man give us the resources that we need in order to survive. When you look at it, the categories of our interaction with our fellow man fall into those two broad categories, and nothing else, either voluntarily or involuntarily. Now, if you look at each one of those examples, the first one is the voluntary interactions. If you look at that, you make you persuade your fellow man to exchange with you by way of offer and acceptance. In those exchanges, both people will gain. We do not, as human beings, we do not voluntarily enter into exchanges with our fellow man where we think we will lose. If we do that, we're not going to meet our own needs. People do not voluntarily enter into exchanges where they think they'll lose. In a voluntary exchange, you have two people coming together at its most fundamental level where both people gain. The person making the offer is making an offer to exchange for something of greater value, or which they assess as being as greater value. And the person accepting the offer also enters into that exchange for something that they perceive of greater value. It is truly a win-win exchange. Now, if we look at the second part of it, which is an involuntary exchange, and this can include aspects of master-servant relationships or even a master-slave relationship. Now, if you look at examples where man dominates man, there are reasons why both parties to that exchange actually lose, even though arguably the person doing the dominating or using the physical force or causing the involuntary nature of the exchange may arguably gain in the short term. Ultimately, they both lose. An example of this is in the American South, where people were physically in chattel slavery, where they were physically dominated by a master. And there are other aspects of this as well. But when you look at that, ultimately that relationship led to the loss of capital. Rather, it was actually a lose-lose transaction on both sides. In the long term, the person being dominated would lose, and ultimately the master would lose as well. The reason for this is, one of the reasons for this is because the person being dominated responds to the threat and or the physical force by basically reducing their output to the minimum necessary that is required in order to survive. Human beings are not like honeybees, for example, or other aspects of nature, where if you harvest their honey, that they will continue to produce honey to be indefinitely harvested. What they will do is change the nature of their behavior to either to produce and hide those outputs, or basically just not produce the honey, not produce the outputs. So the person being dominated reduces their output as a result. So it's a lose-lose proposition on both sides. Another example of this can be seen in Southeast Asia, where it was well recorded, where the hierarchical and dominant nature of the relationships meant that the majority of the people who were living in the rice paddies basically existed day to day and had no incentive to become better people to produce more. So basically people pare back their production to the minimum necessary in order to survive. The other thing about that relationship is it actually consumes capital, including trust. If you break down the trust of relationship with a person, that is a form of breakdown of capital. Basically, it's another way that the involuntary relationships result in a destruction of capital or a lose-lose proposition. I think it's actually in our own interest to cooperate. Again, did you say that, Michael? I think it's in our own interest to cooperate with people. That's the nature of our individual reality, and it's the nature of the reality with which we interact with other people who also are interacting with the real world in a physical way. Man regulates man by way of exchange or by choosing not to exchange. I think we have an equal capacity for good and evil, which can be without limit. But ultimately, we're predisposed to cooperate for reasons of our physical existence and our need to provide for ourselves by way of our exchanges with our fellow man in order to satisfy our own needs. It's in our own interest to cooperate with our fellow man, and for that reason, particularly in the absence of coercion and the absence of force, I think that people are predisposed to actually doing good. If this were not the case, then we would not be producing for each other and cooperating with each other. And the capital that we accumulate as individuals and as a society would not exist. This is not a question about whether we can or should trust our fellow man. Neither am I saying that all people are good. I'm just saying that there is a general predisposition towards doing good and that people will do good or are predisposed to doing so in the absence of coercion. The question of whether we can or whether we should trust our fellow man is a topic for another video. I think it's a worthy goal, and it is also the goal of this group to engage with each other voluntarily on the basis of trust so that we can all gain, as opposed to the involuntary political system of the state where we all lose. Those are my thoughts on the topic for the day. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to talking with you more.